Triangular trade, which is something that we've kind of referenced a couple times here, okay? Um, because kind of this trade route starts with the arrival of Christopher Columbus in the New World, but it really doesn't kind of take its unique shape of being a triangle kind of until the 1600s, okay? So the addition of the Atlantic world to the Old World economy increased trade patterns on pre-existing networks, aka the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean trade routes in the 1500s, okay? However, by the 1600s, the Atlantic Ocean trade routes came to surpass them all in volume of trade. Okay, this is something that we really saw, especially with the importance of the Philippine Islands and how that basically is going to bypass a lot of silver and gold are going to bypass Europe in that way. Okay, Europe will remain kind of the economic center of planet Earth well up till the 20th century. You could make an argument that's even into the 21st century. Okay, and maybe a network of trade that is really only becoming to be challenged today with China's Belt and Road Initiative. Okay, this network of trade in the 16 and 1700s is known as triangular trade. Okay, um, and it's going to be sugar is the main commodity that drives all of this. Okay, so this is as one historian kind of explains it. Okay, despite the commercial importance of India, however, patterns of world trade came increasingly be dominated by Western routes that had developed in response to the lucrative West Indian sugar industry and to the demand for slaves from Africa to work the plantations of the Caribbean. Here, Britain again eventually assumed the lead. Typically, a ship might begin its voyage from New England with a consignment of rum and sail to Africa, where the rum would be exchanged for a cargo of slaves. From the west coast of Africa, the ship would then cross the South Atlantic to the sugar colonies of Jamaica or Barbados, I always mispronounce it, where slaves would be traded for molasses, which would make the final leg of the journey to England, where it would be made into rum. Okay, so the main triangle here is, okay, we start here up in New England. Okay, so these are British colonies. So we're kind of jumping ahead because 1600s really dominated by the Dutch. 1700s really dominated by the British. This is probably going to be why one of the factors the English are going to come to dominate it is because of the importance of the distilleries in this kind of New England area. Okay, so rum is taken to Africa, where it is traded for slaves. Those slaves are then brought to the Caribbean, where they are traded for molasses, which is then brought to New England and traded back for rum. Okay, thus creating a triangle. Okay, you see here the main commodity that is driving all of this is sugar, right? Molasses is the byproduct of sugar production. Okay, so that's the main triangle. Okay, but then you see here you have all these other legs, these kind of side triangles that kind of evolve and emerge because of this. Okay, but the main important driving one is going to be sugar. Okay, the first distillery of rum that's going to take molasses, put yeast in it, alcohol, then distill it, turning it into rum, is going to be actually a Dutch one in 1640 in Staten Island, which was part of New Amsterdam back then. But we see here the English will follow suit and begin to make their own distilleries, and those are going to become more prominent and more important. Okay. They buy the molasses from the Caribbean for dirt cheap, okay, because molasses, before it was being sold to these distilleries, it was just being thrown out by the sugar plantation owners, okay, and then this hard liquor is then sold to African states, okay. Liquor is really what is serving as the conduit for the selling of slaves, okay. In the words of one historian, the African slavers who supplied the Europeans with slaves accepted a range of products in exchange, including textiles, shells, metal bowls, jugs, and sheets of copper. But most sought after by far were strong alcoholic drinks. The Africans in better regions already drank alcoholic drinks, such as palm wine, mead, and various varieties of beer, all of which dated back to antiquity. But alcohol imported from Europe was, in the words of one trader, everywhere called for, even in Muslim parts of Africa. In the early days of the slave trade, when it was dominated by Portugal, African slavers acquired a taste for the strong Portuguese wines. In 1510, the Portuguese traveler Valentin Fernandes wrote that the Wolofs, a people from the Senegal region, are drunkards who derive great pleasure from our wine. Okay, We see rum will replace wine because it is much more cheaper to transport. Okay, um, why is that? Well, rum is a hard liquor where wine is not. What does that mean? That means the alcohol content of rum is much higher than wine. Therefore, you can transport more alcohol if you're transporting rum in smaller spaces than if you're transporting wine. So that's why rum kind of comes to replace this. The same historian goes on. It soon became customary for Europeans to present large quantities of alcohol, known as dashi or bizi, as a gift before beginning negotiations with African traders. The Europeans and Africans conversed in a pidgin language derived from Portuguese, several examples of which were transcribed by a French trader, including Kwai Kwai, Lenin, and Singo Mimembio, give me some strong liquor. According to John Atkins, a British naval surgeon who survived the slave trade, who chronicled the slave trade, the African slaver never cared to treat with dry lips. William Bosman, a Dutch slave trader, recommended that captains of slave ships would make daily gifts of brandy to local leaders and principal traders. The Africans, Uwaida, he warned, would not do business at all unless they had first been presented with sufficient dashi. He that intends to trade here must humor them herein, he wrote. Okay, which we've kind of said, I already talked about this, the leg from Africa bringing slaves to the New World, don't know, is the transatlantic slave trade. Okay, this chart here says it starts 1514, but we know it really kind of starts with the arrival of Christopher Columbus, particularly once these once these natives begin to die out. Okay, they're going to be replaced with Africans, which kind of starts early 1500s. Okay, this is the second phase of the African slave trade that started in 1650 with the arrival of Islam. Okay, the height of this trade is going to be the 18th century, where 75 to 90,000 slaves were shipped across the Atlantic yearly. Okay, putting this in perspective of the 9 million slaves that will be sold across the Atlantic, 6 million of them are going to be taking place in the 18th century. Okay. What might surprise you by this chart, especially with us living in America, the vast majority of these slaves are going to be taken to the Caribbean and to Brazil. Okay. If you look at the Caribbean, which is where we're focused, 35% of these 9 million will be brought to English, French, and Spanish plantations in the Caribbean. Okay. Compare that to North America. The numbers vary. This chart says 307,000. Other estimates run it up as high as 450,000. Okay, but that's roughly kind of 5%. Okay, so that will be an important factor, right? This is something we're definitely talk about, especially with the invention of the cotton gin. Okay, I'm not trying to discredit or limit the horrors of American slavery, because we're going to talk about that in great depth. But something to kind of really focus on here, don't let it confuse you, is where European states are making the majority of their money is in the Caribbean. So that's where the majority of these slaves are being sent. Okay, it's also where the majority of these slaves are being sent because the death rate in the Caribbean is high. Okay. It's hot, it's humid, you have tropical diseases like malaria or yellow fever. Some of these African tribes kind of have immunity to that, but a lot of them that are being brought from the interior don't. Okay, so that's kind of another factor why you see the Caribbean death rate is so high, is a lot of these slaves are dying, which is something we're going to talk about, especially when we get to the Haitian Revolution in the 1800s. Okay, so that is the Atlantic slave trade, or the transatlantic slave trade, kind of whatever you want to call it. The journey they go through, though, is the Middle Passage. Okay? Don't let that confuse you. That happens every year. Some kid writes, he refers to the Middle Passage as the trade route. It's not the trade route. Okay, the trade of this is the Atlantic slave trade. The journey they go through is the Middle Passage. It was horrible in every way you could imagine. Okay, Africans suffered horribly. It was a miserable journey. Okay, they came shackled. Okay, they were taken many times separated from their families already in Africa. Sometimes their families were put with them. They are put in chains and bolted down. and stored as if they are a commodity, because in the eyes of the whites, they are a commodity. Okay, this is feet to head, feet to head, feet to head, in shackles, stacked in various rows. Okay, this was unsanitary. Okay, ships back then, you had rats running around. Um, if you got seasick, and puked, you're going to be laying around puke. If you had to urinate or use the restroom, you were often doing that kind of in there. Especially if you couldn't get one of the guards to come and let you go. Okay, so this is just kind of a filthy, non horrible experience. Difficult to imagine. Make matters worse, this is a month journey, so you're going to have a depletion in muscle mass, excuse me, because you aren't going to be able to get up and move around. Okay, the death rate's roughly 10 to 11%. So you do have instances of people dying next to you and you being shackled to them. And then once the guards figure that out, they'd unshackle them and throw them over the side of the ship and not give them a proper burial. Okay. The Europeans are well aware, okay, of the horrors of this. Okay. But not a single state, whether that is an African state or a European state, makes a move to actually end the slave trade. Okay, basically, just as long as the demand for commodities grown by slaves exists, and they're making money off of it, they're going to continue the slave trade. Okay, this is what one historian named Samuel Merwin is going to coin the law of the balance sheet. Okay, he coins that kind of phrase with regards to the opium. Excuse me, the opium wars in China and the opium trade in China, but it definitely applies here, right? His saying is the balance sheet must balance, right? Basically, what he means by this is if man can profit from this, if he can profit off the misery of others, he's going to do it, even if he knows this is causing widespread suffering. Okay, so this is definitely one of the huge horrific aspects of triangular trade here. Okay, what effect is this going to have on Africa? Okay, there's going to be kind of 4 different things we look at here. Okay, the first one is known as the African diaspora. Okay, a diaspora is basically when you take a group from an area and then you spread them all across a region in the world. Okay, the 2 most famous are the Jewish and the African. Okay, the African diaspora here, you see these African groups are taken from West Africa and then they're dispersed all across the Americas. Okay, and they're basically sent to a region of the world that they've never been to. They don't speak the language. They know nothing about it. Okay, what is the government's effect going to be of states in Africa? You're really going to have the consolidation of power within the states, a few states. Okay, the 2 that you need to know are Ashanti, which is in Western Africa, and then the Congo, which is a little further south. Okay, Congo, kind of modern day Congo area. Basically, these kind of small states grow into very large empires. Okay, because kind of these smaller tribes or kingdoms next to them are going to join them, basically because a strong empire is going to offer them protection from these slaving parties. Okay, these empires are being they're the ones going out and taking these slaves and selling them to the Europeans. The Europeans do not venture into the heart of Africa. Okay, and we did say, with the Dutch and the Portuguese, they are building some forts, but you see a lot of the land that has their warehouses and stuff like that is actually being leased from these kingdoms. Okay, but this is, we can't misconstrue this, right? These kingdoms are being become involved in the slave trade because they really don't have any other option. This is what one historian refers to. It was a painful necessity. Okay, they realized that if they don't go and capture slaves and sell them to Europeans, then the Europeans are going to arm their opposition and overthrow them and basically put a kingdom or an empire in power that would be involved in the slave trade. Okay, so the Europeans are playing these various African states off of each other. Okay, they're playing these economic rivalries off of each other. They're fueling kind of civil wars in Africa that kind of keeps them divided, keep the slave trade running, and keep these African states from becoming too strong and too powerful. Okay. Um, Another effect on Africa of the slave trade is the population is actually going to go up. Okay. Now that seems counterintuitive, right? If a whole bunch of Africans are being taken from Africa, it's taken from their families, the families divided, taken to the New World, sold, okay, auctioned off. If they were with their family across the Middle Passage and then made it to the New World, sometimes those families were being split apart as they were literally being auctioned off and sold. Okay, um, you would think the population of Africa is going down. It's not. It actually grows up, and that's because you have the arrival of new crops. What two new crops are going to lead to an expansion of um, people in Africa? Corn, which they're going to get from Brazil, and then potatoes. Okay, so kind of the same phenomenon we saw in Europe, where these items can be grown a lot more on the same amount of land as like wheat to barley, is actually going to lead to the vast uh, um, population increase. Okay, the last one is a loss of identity. Okay, um, they are taken from their tribes. Okay, they're sent on a plantation where no one else spoke their language, no one else shared their same religion. Okay, over time, all connection to uh, Africa that they have is lost within a matter of generations. You also have a mixing of a lot of cultures in this area. Um, the African tradition of music, okay, with the beats is definitely what is going to eventually incorporate into jazz and then later into reggae. Um, this is where we get gumbo from, right? Gumbo is a West African term that literally means okra. So they came over here and you had this stew that had okra in it, that had all these spices in it, that had seafood from the Gulf in it, that had chicken and sausage from Europe in it, and you cooked it down in a roux, and then you served it over rice. Or if you're from Thibodaux, Louisiana, you serve it over potato salad. Um, that kind of becomes to incorporate here. Basically, these African slaves, with the loss of their African identity, they kind of become more American than African over time. Okay. Um, and if you look in history, at U.S. history, at African Americans attempt to return to Africa, it's never to really kind of assimilate back into mainstream African culture. It's to have the civil liberties that are being denied to them in the United States, particularly under Jim Crow. Okay, one of the most famous men to lead this is Marcus Garvey. Okay, he pushes for this in the 1920s, and y'all probably have heard of the poet Langston Hughes. Yeah, he's going to return to Africa in 1923. On the boat ride there, he very famously throws his collection of books overboard and basically says, I'm done with the white man's knowledge. I'm done with the white man's quote unquote civilization. He arrives in Africa, and he was from the casta system. He would have been a mulatto, so he was a more lighter skin. The Africans actually mistaken him for being white. Okay, um, so the question is, these African slaves in the New World, if they're losing their African identity, what do we call them? Okay, if they're no longer African and they're really more American, well, what do we call them? And the first term that we looked at that comes from the casta system is the Spanish word for black. Okay, so this would be the American Negro. Okay, um, by the 1960s, 1970s, that term's become dated, um, and you see African American kind of becomes the official term for this group. Okay, but you will probably see some primary sources with the American Negro still being used in it, and that's kind of everything on triangular trade and the transatlantic slave trade. Uh, we will be talking later when we get further into the 1800s about how slavery becomes outlawed and kind of the third leg of the African slave trade, and kind of talk about the rest of this later. But for now, this is kind of all we need to know.